Okay. So it's my pleasure to introduce the introducer and mistress of ceremonies for the next panel. So our next panel is, how are we going to overcome the disconnect that we just heard about from Greg between patients, clinicians, insurers, and educators? And we're privileged to have Martha Bebinger from WBUR lead this panel, organize this panel, and entertain your questions. She's not only a veteran of public reporting with a focus on health, but I was just reading up last week a few comments about her from her fellow reporters saying whenever they actually want to know what the real truth is, they go to her. Whenever they actually want to understand what actually happened at a meeting that confused the heck out of them, they'll go to Martha to actually get the clear message. So I really thank Martha for coming here to help us get a clear message on what these obstacles are. And with that, without further ado, I'll just hand it over to the panel. Thank you, Martha.
Thank you so much, Zach. It's great to be here. Welcome, everyone. So we're going to start with some quick remarks from each of our panelists, and they will introduce themselves in the process. We're going to try to focus the questions and the comments today on a couple of very specific areas. Why is the practice not keeping up with the promise of precision medicine? And what can we do to be sure that we don't bake in some of the inequalities in healthcare that we've seen in many, many parts of the healthcare system as we move forward with precision medicine? So, Lisa, I would love it if you would launch us on one of those questions.
Thank you, Martha. It's such a great honor to be here today. Nice to see everyone. I'm Lisa Sunan. I'm the lead of the GE Ventures Healthcare Venture Fund, and also write a blog called Venture Valkyrie and do a podcast called Tectonics with my friend in the back, David Shaywitz, a Harvard grad, which I am not. I have spent the last 30 years working across different parts of healthcare as an entrepreneur in health services, and in the last 20 years as a venture capitalist, primarily investing across the full spectrum of companies, except for molecules, everything but molecules. I don't do that. And having worked in medtech world, in the payer world, in the provider side, on the IT side, with different types of companies and organizations, it's been really interesting to watch this the current evolution of precision health, precision medicine, and those are two, I think, very different terms, have been used very differently. And to me, I think to kind of combine the topics you asked about, Martha, I think the promise is to really think about precision health. What do people actually need? Going back to some of the stuff Greg said, what do people actually need to be well and healthy? Whether they start out, whether you start out with prevention or move, upstream to treatment. And it strikes me that so much of the work going on in medicine and the discovery of new drugs, obviously essential, and we will always pay for new drugs that work for people. It will always be important. And I'm glad there are people doing that. But I'm also struck by the lack of discovery, if you will, or the lack of evolution in the rest of what I would care about in the precision health world, because we have already got mass quantities of knowledge, forget data, knowledge, that tell us what people need to do to be healthier, and we don't do them. And so it worries me that we are spending as much energy as we are on the one side, the pharma side, the development of drugs and the like, and not on the other side, in the development of true prevention strategies, teaching kids about health and nutrition when they're young, making that a fundamental part of learning, thinking about how do you get people to take the drugs that already exist that work really, really well if people only just took them. How do you think about the services that people need and make that important, the development of new services that are efficient and effective for people, in the different settings in which they live, and which are covered by insurance, and which do not, favor those who are only in big cities and the like. When in a world where financing is kind of moved away from services into tech. I think we've spent a lot of money, myself included, investing in tech companies that are not really the solution per se. They're only a tool in the armamentarium for many solutions. So I think for me, I think about precision health broadly and how you need to think about people as holistic entities and not just their body chemistry and biology. And if we don't do that, I fear that this effort will not succeed on the precision medicine side.
Thank you, Lisa. Troy.
Well, I think the question, I'll come at it from the point of view of sort of the insurer. And I think when you talk about personalized medicine, the question is, what is the opposite of personalized medicine? It's not really impersonal medicine, but that may be what most people think sort of insurance companies are all about. It's really public health. And when you're in the insurance business, you're really dependent on sort of parameters that come out of public health, mostly sort of clinical guidelines. So what do the experts say you're supposed to do to treat, to diagnose, or treat something? And you basically then follow those things. And what you try to do to reduce costs, especially in the United States, is to try to reduce the amount of time people are doing things that doesn't have a sort of strong evidence base associated with it, because there's a lot of waste in the American healthcare system. And insurance should be seen as sort of a matter of sort of the common, and what you're trying to do is protect the sort of common interest by making sure that the treatments that are being done by the amount of money everybody's throwing into the insurance pool is appropriate. So you follow the guidelines. So the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association, whoever develops these guidelines, any evidence basis you can find is sort of what you follow. The big problem I've had over the years with personalized medicine is that it's been difficult to get sort of consensus around specific guidelines that in particular tests are going to be cost effective. And we don't do it things from the point of view of sort of that individual, personal. We're thinking about things from the point of view of like, what are the operating characteristics of a test and how do they work in an entire population? So let me give you an example. We're interested in pharmacogenomics because I work at CVS Health, and most of the work we do in managed care is around pharmacy. And we had a pharmacogenomics company that we put up about almost 10 years ago now, and we ran it for about 2 or 3 years, but we couldn't get anybody to sort of use its services, basically because we couldn't get the doctors to change what they were doing because they didn't feel there was a sufficient evidence base to support things that we thought were important, even when there were things like clopidogrel that shouldn't be used in particular patients, and the tests were very clear. Having sort of said that, I get all the time people coming to me with sort of personalized medicine approaches. The most recent one was yesterday. I was having a conversation with some people who have a series of tests that they would like to do in pregnancy, a series of prenatal tests looking for genetic defects. Some of them are done for the parents, and some of them are done on amniotic fluid for the child, the fetus. But I said, tell me about the evidence base associated with this. And they said, ACOG says that any test like this is particularly good. And then I look at the list of insurance companies that have already signed up for this, and neither Aetna nor United are on that list. And so I said, well, why aren't Aetna and United? Well, Aetna and United are following the Society of Maternal Fetal Medicine guidelines, and those guidelines say none of these tests are useful or cost effective or should be done in the average population. So just for me was a great example of the problems that we have. Now, I think those are slowly being cured, both by the fact that a lot of the work that can be done in personalized medicine is getting less and less expensive, and also because there are more people sort of interested in doing long-term studies to see whether or not certain kinds of tests, like, for instance, the pharmacogenomic tests, can really be effective and are cost effective. So I think it's going to change over time. But I would say the impediment that I've seen, at least from the insurance company point of view, is that there hasn't been consensus from the experts that we should be engaging in specific kinds of interventions and specific kind of tests that make up a big part of personalized medicine. So leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Amy Abernathy. I'm the Chief Medical and Chief Scientific Officer and SVP for Oncology at a company called Flatiron Health in New York City. We're a health tech and software company focused on cancer data that was recently acquired by Roche Group. And prior to that, I was an oncologist and scientist at Duke, where I worked as a professor of medicine for a very long time. My comments come from the point of view of being an oncologist, a tech developer, and a scientist. And first, as an oncologist, what's really interesting in this challenge of the promise of precision health and the practical reality is that when we look at, for example, the application of next generation sequencing, and this is a foreshadowing of a paper that will soon to be published based on an abstract that was previously at ASCO, what we saw was that the additive value of next generation sequencing in the cancer space, specifically for lung cancer, is not what you would think in terms of making a difference in overall survival. And that's because at the end of the day, even if we do find mutations, alterations, variants, we don't necessarily have treatments to attack them. And so the dichotomy is that we can now find more potentially targetable and actionable mutations, but don't necessarily have ready in our toolbox the treatments that may make a difference for the patient sitting in front of us. And so we've got a long way to go between what we can find and what we can do. The second is that, when I'm in the clinic, the more things that come at me as an oncologist trying to take care of this person sitting in front of me, the more I have to blend together a whole bunch of details and variables in real time. Not only just the mutation about the tumor, but this person's past medical history, what their environmental exposures are, what their personal beliefs are, what their insurance is. And this has to come together in essentially a continuous multivariable model in my head while I'm also trying to communicate this in a safe way to the patient in front of me. And I don't necessarily have the brain space to do that, nor the technology tools that deliver that information to me in real time in the clinic. And if we're going to have that kind of promise of personalized medicine, we have to have the tools in the clinic, at the bedside, and with the patients to make the difference. The final comment I have is that our science isn't ready. You just mentioned, Troy, about this being about population health as you think about how we take care of populations, but precision health is small cohort science. This is actually figuring out how to take care of individuals and small communities of individuals, and so we don't necessarily have all the tools in the toolbox to do that as well.
Great, thanks. Just a few ground rules. I'm going to start with several questions, and then we'll be coming to you. So you won't be sitting down long, I hope. We'll see a lot of you up at the microphones. I want to come back, though, and be sure that we have some basic definitions in place. We switched back and forth here between precision and personalized medicine. Some people talked about genes. Lisa, maybe you were talking a little bit more about lifestyle and environment. The NIH says all three components, genes, lifestyle, and environment, have to be part of the model that we create for precision medicine going forward. Are we seeing a disconnect between the efforts to try to bring all those pieces together?
You're looking at me, so I'll answer yes.
Yeah.
I think most of the time in healthcare, oddly to me, the pharma world is over here, the med tech world is over there, the payer world is over there, the provider world is over there, and they really don't collaborate very well. And that, of course, leaves out all of the social, functions and the activities of daily living that affect people's ability to heal as well. And I think there is a huge disparity in how we talk about this stuff, to your point about the syntax, and who talks about what and what do they mean. And we don't talk about, I think to Troy's point, which he did talk about, the cost issues that are barriers to how this plays out. It's the economics are, in many areas of these groups taboo to talk about in the same breath as the science side of it. So I think there's a lot of disconnects, and I think there's a lot of people who don't think at all about the social, environmental components when they think about precision medicine. And it's a missed opportunity.
Which probably contributes to the inequalities, I would think.
Certainly doesn't help. I mean, the inequalities are somewhat the definition of what those things are, whether people have access, whether they have, literacy, whether they have money, insurance, and all of the rest, cultural differentials in treatment, certainly amplified when you make it even more complex, yeah.
Does it sound like taboo to you, Troy?
Does what sound like taboo to me?
I'm picking up on, at least do you want to repeat that
The
comment?
last part, the social aspect or the financial?
The taboos that you talked about, we're talking about the two.
Well, I think a taboo I
pieces
talk
together.
about is financial, is that it's very, I mean, let's face it, if the small cohort thing is real, which it is, then pharmaceutical companies are not really incented to develop products from small markets. They're not paid to do that. They don't succeed by making small products. They succeed by making big products. So, but we don't talk about that out in the open very much. I think that area is very taboo.
Well, I don't know about that. The personalized versus precision, I don't know what the difference is between those things. I'd sort of use those same. But, at least for me, it all falls down sort of into relatively sort of similar pathways. Precise medicine, CAR T, for example, you're taking somebody's cells out, you're changing them, and you're putting them back in somebody. That's pretty precise. But in order to sort of look at it, we're going to look at a cohort of 60, 80, 90, good studies in the New England Journal of Medicine. It's not recondite. It comes to my house every week, and I can see sort of how well CAR T works and how many survivors there are and things like that. Incredibly expensive to do. Medicare saying they're really not kind of paying for it at this point. At least what they're going to reimburse the hospitals would be sort of way insufficient. So that brings up the financial points. But the number of people who are going to be treated by that particular technology, at least in certain diseases, is relatively small. And I think that in many ways it was Genzyme here. There's a great book to be written. Unfortunately, Henri Tamir died unexpectedly. He'd be the chief witness. But exactly sort of how Genzyme cracked the code on treating what were considered to be sort of developing orphan drugs for basically orphan diseases. What we're seeing is that increasingly sort of small numbers of individuals are the target nonetheless of reasonable sort of intervention by pharmaceutical companies. It's just that in order to sort of make what they feel like make ends meet to treat those small populations requires tremendous payment. And in many circumstances, it's very difficult to say it didn't work. It does look like it's working in certain circumstances. And it's difficult to resist treating it. So it creates an incredible social problem, especially as we get this intense grinding noise as we go through the 20s of the aging of the population and the affordability of our healthcare system.
Yep.
All these questions are going to become much more acute.
I think we need to bring Medicaid into the conversation as well, because the gaps in payment that we are starting to see grow between what private insurance covers and what Medicaid covers are going to explain a lot of the inequalities we're going to have going forward with some of these really promising therapies. Do you agree, Amy? Or
I think the gap's going to happen with Medicaid. It's going to happen in all directions, though. And so I think one of the challenges becomes each time, it becomes almost like whack-a-mole. Each time we identify one area where there's going to be an increasing gap, it becomes another area where we see an increasing gap. And so we've got to be able to pay attention to taking care of whole populations in the way that Troy pointed out, but also small cohorts within the whole populations. One of the other things that concerns me is that we need to have at our ready better mechanisms to acknowledge what works for small cohorts, but then follow that over time so that we can easily and more efficiently and cheaply get drugs across the line when it looks like they're effective, but then also continue to monitor those drugs. And I think that applies for Medicaid as well as for all the populations.
Mm-hmm, right. So this is my last question. Anybody who wants to jump up to the mic and get engaged, we've got a great group of very diverse thinkers up here on the panel. Love to hear from you. I wonder if we could just talk a little bit more about price. Mr. Simon addressed that towards the end of his conversation, but didn't really bring up the value-based pricing models that some of the pharmaceutical firms are starting to use. If you're not familiar with that, and I assume most of you are, but it's the notion that there's a contract negotiated at the beginning so that the pharmaceutical firm and usually the insurance company decides what success rate is going to trigger the payment for, at what level for that drug. Does that cover it more or less?
Not really.
Okay, sorry,
I mean, what happens from the point of view of sort of if you're going to pay for a drug, for instance, a PBM, the thing that triggers the coverage is that it actually sort of works. And you have an independent P&T committee that you're consulting, and they say, this is a drug that works. It's going to have to be added to the formulary because the formulary is expected to sort of basically be the standard of care expected of the reasonable medical practitioner. The drug companies have the decision about sort of what the price is going to be, the so-called launch price, and that's completely up to them. And in a situation in which they've got patent protection and there's no competing medication, there's no constraints on exactly sort of what that price looks like.
But there certainly are developments of pricing like you're describing. I mean, companies that are talking about negotiating contracts that are value-based, value being an interesting term, and and that are going to vary whether you get paid or not, or whether you get paid a certain amount or not based on some sort of designated outcome. They're not widely used yet, and the whole healthcare system is not really oriented to that quite yet.
But I think that's the world that precision medicine is emerging into to some degree, is this notion that we need to start paying for value instead of volume, or in addition to volume to some degree.
Well, just the simplest way, at least from my point of view, to do that is to use comparative effectiveness. And, ICER is, Steve Pearson, the ICER team is basically providing a nice foundation for analysis of the comparative effectiveness of medications and indicating, obviously as the price comes down, the comparative effectiveness goes up, and sort of setting thresholds associated with that. And Bob Gowan and I proposed over a year and a half ago that one approach would be for companies where a drug is launched at a launch price that's greater than $100,000 per quality adjusted life year not be covered. That would put pressure then on the pharmaceutical manufacturers to come in at what would be a sort of value-based pricing, just sort of on this pricing issue. So there are ways to do that, and that's not like rocket science. That's something that everybody in Europe does today. If you come in at more than $50,000 per quality adjusted life year, you're either facing an authority or a jawboning to get the price down, and that's why the prices are lower there.
50K is the threshold there. Got it. Sorry, Amy. Jumping.
So, we're seeing value-based pricing, we're seeing indication-based pricing. We are now starting to see specifically outcomes-based pricing. The interesting challenge here is, and this is specific to the precision medicine space, as we start to think about real outcomes-based pricing, where you say price and pay for this drug, reimbursement for this drug if it works for this patient, you have the challenge that we also need an underlying system or infrastructure that is able to now interrelate patient, treatment, and outcome, likely including toxicity. And so that core underlying infrastructure is currently based on spreadsheets, and it's very, very hard to follow. And so that's going to be one of the things that needs to be put in place if we're going to see this happen and grow in precision medicine.
And you also have to, I think, account for, what's the patient's role in this? Are they following the plan as they're supposed to? Is it the drug that's making them healthier, or the change in diet that they just, also adopted? Who's really, causing the outcome? What's really causing the outcome? How do you split, the economics outcome of that? I think it's very complex. And frankly, still most of the healthcare system, 95% or so, is still fee-for-service. So there's really not an orientation in the delivery system to rely on these models yet. I mean, it's coming, but, so is Jesus apparently, but not today.
Yeah. Hi. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Keith Batchelder, Genomic Healthcare Strategies. Thanks to the panelists and the organizers. I find this interesting that precision medicine is talking about how they fit and work in the real world, addressing it in a more concrete way. I don't want to derail this, but do you think that there's going to be any impact from the recent announcement of Jeff Bezos and Warren Buffett and J.P. Morgan? Before you say no, and they haven't told us what they're going to do, I would characterize them as some people with a lot of money, an interest in changing the system because they find it not working really well for them, and maybe a long event horizon where they're willing to work. So do you think that's going to have any impact on you?
It has the potential to. I mean, you're right. Long event horizon is a good thing. Employers have more flexibility than others in the system.
And they know how to engage with customers, I'd say, a lot better than the healthcare system does.
One thing you know for sure about that experience is that the consumer experience is likely to be better than it is in the typical health interaction.
I think
Okay.
the other thing that you're likely to see out of this is a much better technical infrastructure to support personalized and precision health. At the end of the day, at least some component of this is a data and technology problem, and they certainly have the skill set to take that part on.
And the money.
And the money.
Say, if you liked CAR T, you will like.
I think you were at the mic next, and then we'll cross over. Hi, what's your name?
Hi, my name is Jenny Barbra, and thank you everyone for being here today. I've spent my entire life in devices, so I'm going to bring up two parts of the puzzle that I think we haven't touched on today. The first is screening and early screening, because the only way we can treat is if we can screen and diagnose. And then the second area that I'd like to touch on is the developing world, where obviously there's a lot of data and how to capture that. So I'm on the board of a company called POC Medical Systems in Livermore, California, and we've developed a technology to do early screening for breast cancer, and our focus is in India. So this is something that could then lead to a lot of data, and in this piece of the puzzle, we're trying to figure out actually our US strategy, because we feel like we have the developing world strategy as figured out as we can at this point through government mass screening programs. So my question is for Troy. In the US, thinking about the future, thinking 5-10 years down the road when everyone can walk into a CVS and get everything they need, do you think that it would be possible for someone to come in and get a very low cost blood test in one of your centers and clinics? And is that something you might be considering or looking at for another way to not only treat patients through your services, but to actually help through the screening process?
Yes, I think so. I mean, we're very avid for low-cost, finger-stick-based, CLIA-waived tests that we can get results on right away. For certain things, we can do that right now, and there's a promise, at least in technology, not Theranos, but other companies where I think that we're going to be able to accomplish that. And for us especially, because our big play is convenience, because we've got the convenience location of the stores, is to be able to sort of diagnose and then treat while the patient's seeing us at our clinics in the stores. So we think that there's a lot of potential for that, and we see a lot of ways in which, as you might know, we're proposing to acquire the insurer Aetna, and we see there's a lot of ways in which we can sort of translate the kinds of things that we can do in the stores into a real population health strategy.
Thanks. Hi, sir, what's your name?
I'm Adama Han.
And what is your question?
My question is that in order to overcome the disconnections between related parties, including clinicians, educators, insurance, big farms, and investors, so who should take the leadership role, and what are driving force for them to take the leadership role to overcome the disconnections? Can we think of a top-down scheme or a bottom-up scheme to design the strategies to facilitate the disconnection problem?
So leadership role in addressing these gaps. Anybody taking that on?
So I'll start, and I think that one of the things you're pointing out is that in order to address these gaps, we've got a challenge that there's lots of different points of view, but we need some leadership to push that forward. At the end of the day, I think at least some element of that needs to be based on our public, which is our government. So our government needs to have a leadership role in helping us move precision medicine forward, and we've seen a number of pushes come from the government space, whether that's from the NIH or also from the administration and other areas.
State levels as well.
Excuse me?
And the state levels.
And the state levels as well, exactly. I also think that as a public, we've got a responsibility to talk in the public space about what is meaningful for us with relation to health and actually how we're going to move that forward. So there's also a public and societal responsibility too.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that the people who benefit from this, these developments, whether it's the pharma systems or the provider system, whomever it may be, have a responsibility to engage with each other to create an environment that this can be effectively deployed in. I think this is a very complex situation, very complex set of opportunities, and joining into an already complex and very, misaligned from an incentive standpoint healthcare system. So some of that alignment needs to, I think, occur probably through government means before, or through private means like the Amazon, initiative, in order for it to prosper.
Can I add one other piece here? So I also sit on the board of directors for the Personalized Medicine Coalition. I've been there for a long time. I was previously on the executive board. I'm struck from the PMC point of view that when any one particular group champions the precision medicine space, it gets off balance. So if only the diagnostic groups champion precision medicine, suddenly precision medicine is diagnostics and targeted therapies. And so we have a responsibility of having all the voices at the table and cross-checking each other to make sure that we've got all the voices at the table. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to push the whole space forward.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi, I'm Aly Analytics-led intelligence. My question is, why would you ever need to do any tests, period? If you could just speak in your phone and it tells you all kinds of things about your history and your future, when you're going to get ALS or something, Or you just look into the camera of your phone and it tells you your blood sugar, your blood pressure, and all kinds of other things at the molecular level. Not just your past, but also your future.
Do you have that company available to fund?
But the power of the device is significant.
Yeah, it's just another methodology for screening, though, right? I mean, it's not a changed thought. It's a changed methodology. I agree that devices and technology may make this better, stronger, faster, cheaper. It doesn't answer the question of, then what do you do from a treatment standpoint?
Another diagnostic.
Hi, Doug Clark. I had a question on your precision health, and who do you think owns driving the standards to get there across all the systems, whether it be EMR, claims, and how the data is collected so that you can get to the aggregate view?
So I probably should take this one.
Go for it.
So the question was who owns the standards, and this again could be something that's pushed from the government point of view, although it's kind of an interesting challenge because when you think about data standards, data models, and interoperability, for example, which is part of what you brought up, at the end of the day, it is use case specific, and so wanting to make sure that what we do is develop the right standards required for the use cases and sitting in front of us. What's been interesting is to watch this from multiple hats, so both from inside of Flatiron as well as from my academic hat. And what I can tell you is that the best way to get to applicable standards is to have real use cases that you actually have in play and work backwards. And so I see this as something that happens as a multi-stakeholder activity, as stakeholders across industry, academia, and government start realizing that they're all solving the same problem, and you work your way back into it.
In a day of extremely odd news stories, the one I saw today that really struck me was that CMS floated a plan to require interoperability of systems in order to bill Medicare, and that the American Hospital Association went berserk and fought back hard against it. You gotta take away the incentives to be the data hoarder, as we talked about earlier today, and be collaborators. You gotta tie, it's always follow the money, right? You gotta tie the incentives to the outcomes, or the, this conference will be the same for the next 10 years.
Well, and we want two different kinds of interoperability. We want interoperability to take care of patients, which is to move this individual person's record around so that we can take care of them. And then we want interoperability of data so we can learn from it, and those are two different tasks that require very different kinds of standards.
Zach.
Hi. Great panel. I have a question that relates to something that Greg Simon articulated. I didn't see this coming, but he talked about how the drug companies and the payers would somehow create a market together, maybe a futures market. And in some sense, there is already a discussion happening between them. We know that for some very expensive pharmaceuticals of a class, there will be discounts made by the pharmaceutical company with the payer. But that's well short of what Greg was imagining. And while we have these expert panel here, I'd love to hear what their thoughts are about how these two big players, the generators of these new medicines and those who pay for them, might be able to create a more rational, productive movement to their use.
Your turn.
I don't know. I didn't hear that part of the presentation. I don't know exactly. But the stuff that we do right now is relatively sort of straightforward, which is that if a drug comes out and it's equivalent to another drug, and the experts say these two drugs are equivalent, then we can negotiate with the pharmaceutical manufacturers for a lower price through a rebate, and then we put the drug that wins that negotiation by having the lowest price onto the formulary, and the other one isn't on the formulary, and it's basically like a narrow network approach, which is that you're willing to trade lower price for more volume, and that's really been the story on the insulins, for example.
And forgive me for the following question, then I'll let Amy jump in. And do you see that creating market pressures around price?
Oh yeah. Well, I say it creates. So when we go in and talk to our clients, who are basically health insurers or self-insured employers, we're being judged basically on what price we can offer. We try to offer a lot of other things like improved adherence and things like that, but what they're most interested in is what the price is going to be on the panel of drugs that they're purchasing. And if you get a lower cost for a particular thing, then overall their costs are going to be lower. And because we compete between, well, the main competitors would be CVS, Optum, and Express Scripts, because we're all in there at the same time sort of competing on price, they're ever lowering the price for the medications, which is why, at least in our data, we've seen the drug price costs inflation at 3%, 2%, and now 0.9% the last 3 years. So, the evidence is, and that evidence is the same that CMS Office of the Actuary is showing today, is that those particular approaches, along with the other things we do, which is basically sort of step therapy and prior authorization, are working. Now, if you're a person who's uninsured or you're in a gap because you've got a high deductible plan, then you're going to see sort of higher costs in that plan. And unless your particular employer or insurer takes those rebates that they're getting, and we retain less than 5% of the rebates are almost entirely going to the client. But if that rebate doesn't show up at the point of sale, then you don't get to take advantage of that reduction in cost. But I don't know what the futures market was. Maybe you all.
Yeah, I had this. It was great hearing you, Greg, talk about that. I thought it was such a sort of compelling thought to think about. Guys running around on a stock exchange floor, selling hepatitis futures or something. I mean, one of the biggest challenges, right, is what you pointed out, is that the cost of drugs that might cure somebody today have such a long-term payoff, in terms of outcome, that the person may have left that employer, the person will have left that health plan, average 2-year span or so in health plans, unless it's Medicare, a little longer for the managed care plans. In any event, the cost is born in the beginning, and the value may be realized in the end. And so, how do you balance that equation? I mean, what it leads me to think is that most of these types of things, these very expensive long-term outcome drugs, will have to start in single-payer, government-paid systems where the public market and the quarter-to-quarter, thing won't matter.
I would disagree with that, mostly because on several points. First of all, the shuffle between the insurers is basically a stochastic process, so it's random, and the actuaries have taken that into account for years. And generally, you're covering the drug based on the standard of care, not an economic calculation about sort of when the return is going to be. If it's in part of the standard of care, you've got to cover it. I think the real problem is more sort of the upfront thing where, you got somebody who needs gene transplantation for a rare congenital eye disorder. If you happen to be the one who's insuring that individual at that time,
right,
then you're absorbing all those sort of one-time costs.
Right.
So there's a lot of conjecture about sort of how that cost might be sort of spread over time. But right now, at least, with reinsurance mechanisms, you can handle those costs.
So I was really intrigued by this model, and as Greg was talking about it, I was sort of imagining this world for my children. But, you know, there was two points of view that I had, both the positives and the negatives. On the positive side, you can imagine that if insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies are working together, you've got a couple of things that might happen. For example, the insurance companies will help to prioritize, here are the things that we need addressed soon. You also potentially end up with a landscape where, you know, you've got insurance company A who's teamed up with Merck and the other one who's teamed up with BMS, and that, you know, that actually becomes essentially a marketing tool in order to identify both best drugs as well as sort of best insurance company in class. The challenge that I think we run into is what I'm going to call an MVP, or minimal viable product challenge, where now you've got two organizations.
Amy, why don't you come sit here? I'm going to move to the podium. Just pop over here.
Okay, sure.
Do you think it's that mic? I wouldn't come
You've got an MVP problem where you don't have the two organizations now cross-checking each other, that drugs don't get out into the public space until they're ready to be out in the public space. The FDA's role or some other regulator role becomes that much more important in that particular space. But that was pretty intriguing.
Thanks, Zach. Hi, what's your name? Sorry to keep you waiting so long.
No worries. Hi, Ariana Winder, Accrual and Optimization of Clinical Trials for Penn State University. I'm looking at the topic of the panel and your backgrounds, and recently the Right to Try bill was signed by the president, and I'm also splitting my time between DIA, the other conference going on this week, and yesterday we had a soapbox on Right to Try with a bioethicist and attorney who, I'm still digesting this, but I'm wondering just broadly what you think about it and if you might agree. She said it's actually the right to ask. And in working in clinical trials, you know, I guess I kind of take that for granted. You know, patients come in and say, you know, there's a lot of media hype about this announcement. I'm just wondering what you think about it. She gave a lot of information, but one of the big take-home ideas that I left with was, you know, a lot of times we pin the agency with the as the main decision maker, but really it's in the hands of the sponsors and the drug companies. But maybe as a community, we could help push this conversation further. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
I'll start. You know, so I'm an oncologist. I live this world. I haven't taken care of patients for a while, but I've spent the last 3 days taking care of a very close friend of mine who's dying. You know, at the end of the day, we've had compassionate use for a long time. Our task with compassionate use is to figure out how to collect the data around what's going on when these drugs are used in order to actually incorporate that into our knowledge set. And one of the reasons that it's become so hard for compassionate use to happen is because if you're a drug company, the toxicity that goes along with giving a drug to a patient who's very near the end of life, it's hard to tease out what's toxicity and what's related to the disease, et cetera. And in the landscape of Right to Try, that actually gets magnified and harder for drug companies, not easier. So I think that the ability to just access drugs is a challenge. The other side of this that really worries me is that tox and essentially really, really bad effects of drugs are not well understood by the public and how real that really is. And so Right to Try, which is sort of right towards efficacy, is not understood in the balance towards rights of essentially experience of toxicity that can be more devastating than people realize.
There's also a cost to I mean, not to sound uncompassionate, but there's a cost to these companies, particularly for these, you know, like a cell therapy methodology or something. They're very expensive to provide that to all comers, especially, you know, in the case where they may not be theoretically qualified for the treatment or actually qualified for the treatment. And I don't know, that's a really tough balance, I think. I mean, I think it's, if I were the patient, I'd certainly want it, right? I mean, I think it's a really tough balance, though, when you think about companies and the balance between the science and the cost as well.
Yeah, I'm kind of on the Jerry Avorn, Aaron Kesselheim view on this, that, you know, actually regulation works and pharmaceutical regulation works, and the drugs that should be in the market and that people should be using should go through rigorous testing before and be approved by the FDA. So not supportive of the legislation overall. And then the other part of it is there's nothing in the legislation that requires any sort of insurance payment for this. So you've got people sort of right to try, but these are going to be, in most cases, very expensive medications. So I don't know that I see it as sort of a step forward.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hello, my name is John Birch. I'm a member of the Mid-America Angel Investment Group in Kansas City. And I have a question about a new kind of medical technology that seems to offer a lot of hope, but it's not yet possible, and that is software as a medical device, SAMD as they call it, S-A-M-D. And as you may know, the FDA has for some time been working on ways of beginning to regulate this category of thing. But markets are coming into existence because of FHIR and because of some degree of standardization of the data, although that's probably the biggest barrier. I guess my question is, who's going to pay?
I think it'll go through the same efficacy, cost-benefit analysis as any other treatment at the payer, and it should. I mean, I think, if it's Aetna or Optum or whomever it is, and this therapy is proven to be effective.
It's not necessarily going to be therapy, though a lot of it will be diagnostic. Dean Daly this morning was talking about the cognitive limits of individual clinicians being able to process lifelong data on their patients that just come in. They're going to need cognitive automation tools to help with that, and that's really, I think, where the growth is in the future. But it is somewhat difficult as to what category it fits into in terms of payment.
Yeah, I agree, though. It goes through the sort of regular process, and we're seeing you look at something like sleep medicine, for example. The apps that are available have sort of 10 to 12 rigorous randomized controlled trials demonstrating efficacy. You've got the American College of Physicians basically endorsing a digital approach as your first step to people who are having sleep problems. You've got expensive and dangerous medications that are overused in the population in order to induce sleep. So from our point of view, it's a slam dunk. It's less expensive, it's safer, and it appears to be sort of more efficacious. When the evidence is available, the system works great.
Yeah.
Agree.
Hi. And let me just say, for the 5 of you who are still standing, those will be our last questions. Sorry to anybody who's still got one germinating in your brain there, but if you could try to keep these brief. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Hugo. I recently wrote a commentary article on the journal Nature Biotechnology, and I covered some aspects of precision medicine at the intersection of health policy, science, and technology, digital technology. Stage diagnosing is a critical factor in determining overall outcomes. However, most of the precision medicine paradigm right now is focused on developing symptomatic solutions for late-stage diseases. What do you guys think are the major gaps in order to make a transition from developing those symptomatic solutions that don't really work and going to actually developing solutions that address the root cause of disease at the earliest stages where chronic complex diseases can be actually addressed better?
The further we get sort of towards better and better early diagnostics, the better off we're all going to be. I think we'd all agree on that. What's interesting is that I'm an oncologist, so I'll use a cancer lens for a second, but I think it applies pretty broadly. We use our late-stage disease experience to try and understand when things are pretty well differentiated and we understand the disease well, and then move that information up earlier in the disease spectrum. And I would hope that that's what we continue to do, whether that's better diagnostics, the better use of circulating DNA, et cetera. But really, the task is to figure out how to diagnose with as much precision as possible and move that earlier.
Although, there's also something to be worried about with respect to matching diagnosis with available treatments, to what you said earlier.
Right.
I mean, we can diagnose lots of things we can't treat now, and that doesn't necessarily do anybody any good. So I think we have to balance how much testing we do in the system.
The one other thing to say here, and again with the cancer lens, but widely applicable across disease, is that we still have a lot of inaccurate diagnostics that happen right now. And so the better that we can get at improving the precision, so that, for example, in lymphoma, the 25% of patients whose disease is now re-diagnosed, or the actual underlying interpretation of the pathology changes, that won't keep happening, because we're essentially treating the wrong disease then.
But I want to come back to just be sure that we keep the patient at the focus of the conversation, and mention ways that you can encourage patients to be healthy from the very early stages. You can figure out who's at risk for what and pay them to exercise or pay them to stay on their nutritional regimen. I really think a lot of that stuff is coming with the technology that we carry around every day.
Great point.
Some of it, but those, sort of structured bribery programs have not proven to be long-term effective.
That's true. Yeah.
But they really haven't. I mean, unfortunately, or I would, happily enroll myself.
Do you know
in
why?
them. I mean, Omada's done a decent job getting people, preventing the advent or the progression of type 2 diabetes. It's sort of like that. I mean, there aren't many that have been long-term effective. There have been a few, that are tried by larger insurers that have gone for a while. But after, 3, 6, 9 months, people sort of fall off the excitement wagon,
Yeah.
The most assiduous work on it's been done by Kevin Volp's group at the University of Pennsylvania and their nudge programs, and unfortunately, I'd say of sort of like 15 major trials, about 13 of them are negative. In other words, they haven't been able to. But so there are clearly some things that work, like their smoking cessation work on negative deposit approaches for smoking. That's clearly something that we should be adopting. So like other scientists, they're persistent, they're trying new things, and the insurance companies are avid for this kind of stuff, because it's, as you said, go where the money is. If they can get a population to engage in these kinds of programs, and people find the programs helpful, they stick with the insurance companies in the long term, that pays off in terms of sort of lower costs on down the line.
Futures trading. Hi.
Hello, I'm David Kruda. I'm on the Sync for Science project at DBMI. Here's my question, and I realize this may not be an international panel, at least it wasn't constructed in that way. But here's the thing. If the science is the same internationally, the healthcare systems are different. And so my question is there any evidence that precision medicine is being pursued differently, better, or otherwise in any of the other socially wealthy, well-educated countries in the world? And if there is an example of its being adopted and used more effectively, what would inhibit its being adopted in a similar way here?
I don't know.
There's better data collaborations, I think, in some of the socialized medicine countries, in the UK, for instance. Whether that has resulted in, a different type of adoption model for precision health, I don't know. Longer lifespan, yeah, but that's, been a long time. It has nothing to do with the latest, greatest science.
Lisa, when you say better data collections, are you getting back to that uniform standard that we were talking about earlier?
Yeah, I mean, if the whole country uses the same, effectively EMR or other type of system to collect data, and has, ways of compelling the participants in those systems to share, which they do, you have a bigger, more fulsome, more diverse data set to use for discovery or for clinical decision support or for whatever.
Scandinavian systems in particular.
Yeah, great.
So I just wanted to see if, Troyen, if you could respond to my question. Because as you are here and talking about insurance industries, I know that insurance practices are different in other countries and the like. Do you see anything there that has any bearing on how the private insurance industry works here, or could, with respect to precision medicine at this time?
Well, our company is by far the biggest company in the country that has almost no international business. So I would say from a business point of view, we know Quincy pretty well, but we don't know much about what's going on in Denmark. But putting that to the side, I'd say that the trials are active, and the companies that are active in precision medicine at a sort of big level, many of them are European-based. And the major difference that you see, there is better data collection. The Italians have always been very proud of their ability to sort of collect oncology data, for example. And in Denmark, they have everybody's on the same electronic medical record, and it falls into the sort of same data set. So there are some opportunities to follow up. But you see, most of the large trials are international trials. And the major difference is just sort of what the willingness to pay is. The willingness to pay is about 20, 30, 40% of what the willingness to pay is in the United States. And if you're developing precision medicine, you're looking for a reasonable sort of bonus from the United States in terms of what we're willing to pay. But there are viable markets in Europe, and so you'll take advantage of those. But it's mostly about sort of what the willingness to pay is and the orientation towards that.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Ned Bacon. I'm a systems engineer, spent my career in the aerospace industry. I was at the conference last year, and one of the threads of stories that came through were a large number of or most of the presenters talked about development for small cohorts of patients, which necessarily resulted in very large prices for the drugs that they developed. And that was to their benefit, but not to the benefit of huge populations who needed antibiotics, for example, that were becoming less efficacious, and the big public health benefits that would derive from that kind of development, which apparently isn't happening as much for economic reasons now. So my question is, whose job is it to establish those priorities? It seems to me one of the big challenges for precision medicine from a societal level will be that challenge of figuring out the priorities.
Great question. I'll start, and then I suspect Troy and Lisa have some things to add here. As a country, one way that we've pushed towards establishing those priorities is through legislation such as 21st Century Cures and other actions. And so with respect to 21st Century Cures, there are, for example, components that push towards making it more efficient to start to develop drugs for small cohorts, including the ability to sort of think about, for example, adaptive design trials and platform trials, the ability to reinforce the role of surrogate endpoints and of being able to think about accelerated approval, and then the role of using data to then follow those cohorts once the drugs get approved over time, including then ability to expand drugs across to other indications once the drug has been approved. So, for example, label expansions. So there's actions that have been taken place from the legislative side, also included, I believe, and this part I don't know nearly as well, around, for example, prioritizing drug development in the infectious disease space. So we have a mechanism to start to make that happen on the legislative front that then is followed by regulations, for example, through PDUFA. The challenge becomes that the science has to happen in parallel. So we have to have the understanding of biology, we've got to have the clinical development, and we have to have companies that are ready to take their drugs through the clinical development process in line then with essentially a market ready to go on the other side. So all of those things have to happen in concert. But we can start with, on the legislative side, prioritizing mechanisms to allow that to happen, including in the infectious disease space, and for pediatrics, for example, the Race for Children Act that just happened.
We're getting this leadership coordination question a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we live in a market-based economy, like that's the truth. And the biggest, I think, indicator of the problem is that cardiovascular disease kills a lot more people than cancer, but the amount of funding for cardiovascular drugs has gone down phenomenally, comparatively. So, because the market for value is in oncology right now, that's the truth. And, it'll swing somewhere else later maybe, or, who knows. But, without the government either granting or nonprofit organizations providing grants and financial incentives or whatever to prioritize other things than, what we're talking about here, people do it based on the money they can make in their companies or their perception of that.
And where the biology is.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's an equal mixture of, sort of scientific information and market.
I'm just more jaded than you.
Well, you know, you have to have an insight that something's potentially going to work.
Sure.
But then, you know, you're sort of making, and I would say that the market and science play a much bigger role than around the edges as I've sort of seen regulation. You know, that may change over time, but right now I'd say most of it's entrepreneurs out there with insights, see the disease state. Can there be a reasonable sort of return from that? Well, I mean, the companies are basically, there's a ton of sick patients out there with diseases that can't be treated right now. So I think the pharmaceutical manufacturers are definitely, you know, sort of thinking, you know, when they think about their job and what they're doing good for the world, they are coming up with cures for individual patients. But they're going to be doing that prioritization based on a set of sort of market incentives. I don't know if that's necessarily sort of unfortunate. They are going to end up helping patients, but they're going to be betting on sort of things that they think they're going to get a market return from, and that betting is going to be based on what they think the overall efficacy is of it's going to be for their disease. But
we've seen some cool stuff from patients, though, like, you know, the efforts of Patients to Fund the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation that led to the funding and, you know, of the drug company that created, you know, a really good drug for that, right? And created enough money to go back to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation that they can keep doing that forever. So, I mean, there are patient-led initiatives that can help drive, but again, I think the economics of that are powerful and sort of incentivizing entrepreneurs to pick things that are other than the obvious in a current market.
Hi.
Hi, great panel, thank you so much. Katya Tsayon, Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, evidence-based toxicology collaboration. So my question was to Troy about the use of expert opinion, but while I was listening to this, since I have a PhD from a local school here at Tufts School of Nutrition, so nutrition was mentioned in passing and some of the success or lack of success of trials. I want to remind everyone that there are medical professionals who are trained, they're called registered dietitians, who study evidence-based approaches to changing lifestyle modification, and they are essentially out of many of the medical decisions and out of medical practice. There's 80,000 of them in this country who are trained in this, and there are systematic reviews that you are welcome to go on Cochrane Collaboration website. There are approaches that actually long-term work. They require nutrition physical every year, perhaps as a follow-up, but there are very specific approaches that actually work for long-term lifestyle modification. Okay, so with that, I have a question to Troy on, so you mentioned that in your value-based pricing model assessments and outcome-based pricing, use this expert opinions. Are they based specifically on disease foundations? Is it transparent somewhere on your website on how you use those expert opinions, where they come from, who are those experts?
So two different things, I think. I think I caught it. I've complained to Joe Martin about the acoustics in this room, but to no avail. I'd say that on the one hand, on the comparative effectiveness thing, if we used anything there, we would rely on sort of outside experts, outside organization. ICER provides that, and they are very public about the experts that they consult. And
do you want to just spell out what ICER is, just in case anybody hasn't?
Institute for Comparative Effectiveness Research
yeah,
or something like that. What do? They basically analyze the data that's available on how well medications work, and then they come up with estimates about how much each individual medication is worth per quality adjusted life year, and it gives you an opportunity to sort of compare things. So cystic fibrosis, yeah, Vertex got a lot of funding from Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, but the medications are coming in at $300,000 or $400,000 per quality adjusted life year. So that means we're spending more there. Now, if I'm treating somebody with hypertension with generic medications, I'm probably at about $500 per quality adjusted life year. So, or antibiotics, some of those things can even be sort of cost saving. So it just provides you with a scientific approach to being able to compare how good certain kinds of medications are and what they should be priced at. That's different than what you do at the pharmacy benefit managers. By law, under the Medicare, and by contract with regard to all of our commercial clients, we have to have an independent pharmacy benefits pharmacy and therapeutics committee, and that's made up of 25 to 30 experts who meet on a quarterly basis, and they have to be free of any conflicts of interest, so they can't be working for pharma at all. And we can pay them sort of by the hour for work they do for us, but they can't have any other conflicts. And that group has to approve any decisions we make about formulary or utilization management or step therapy. And their approval process, what we're asking them is, what is the standard of care? And they're fed by groups of individuals in various different disease states, probably for us over 200 experts who we consult about very specific medications and what we should do. So we have a Hep C group, a pulmonology group, a lipid group, those kinds of things who provide them with information.
So how does the evidence-based medicine fit into this, or is it a separate?
So they are telling us what their read is of the evidence-based medicine, and at the same time we're basically consulting the existing literature. We have about 30 pharmacists who do nothing but sort of review what's in the pipeline and review information about medications and provide that input to these experts. So we make sure they're grounded in evidence-based medicine.
Thank you. Thank you. And last question, hi.
Thank you. Hi, Carol Weil with the National Cancer Institute, and my question is for Amy. And I'd like to ask you about the issue of hope versus hype in precision medicine clinical trials, and specifically when you have targeted therapeutics and you're enrolling patients on treatment arms based on their personal genomic profile. Do we need to have a different paradigm for talking about research? Because it really is sort of a hybrid research endeavor when you're treating someone based on their own profile.
Yeah, great point. So the questions around hope versus hype, and it's really hard because when you're in the clinic and you're talking to this person and you're saying, listen, here's what I think is the best thing to do for you in this particular situation. You also, frankly, want to promote hope that goes along with now this treatment working for you. The challenge being that if it's a clinical trial, especially if it's a randomized trial, there's equipoise. So you've got to be able to carefully help the person understand that we expect that this treatment that's the standard is going to work as well as possible, and that this new treatment is hopefully going to be incrementally better, but somehow convey that the reason why we're doing this clinical trial is because indeed we don't actually really know. So there's this kind of very careful line you've got to walk in talking a person through that, recognizing that number one, if you're a cancer patient sitting in the clinic, you've heard about the first two sentences and then everything else is really almost incomprehensible because you're still working on the first two sentences. And also, you want the hope, right? You want the thing that ultimately gives you potentially a better future. So I think we've got the task, first of all, of being as careful as possible about how we talk to people, but also recognize the practical realities of what we all want when we're sitting there in a dire situation. The other task is that we've got to get smarter and smarter about how we do our clinical trials, and when we do a trial, when does it need to be randomized or not? How many patients actually need to be in this trial? How can we understand the value of a drug as quickly as possible, figure out how to then get it to patients, but also monitor patients across time, and then start to revise how we use drugs. One of the things we've been working on at Flatiron together with NCI and others is the role of, for example, real-world data to act as a contemporaneous external control arm so we don't have to randomize as many patients to standard of care, and we can shorten timelines for clinical trials. As many ways that we can actually figure out how to do clinical trials more smartly and also help communicate what we're trying to do with patients is the best thing we can do.
Amy, I hear some physicians talking about an internal problem of hope versus hype, though, in that sometimes the promise of the precision medicine, CAR T, whatever option might cloud their judgment about using some of the more traditional therapies. Do you hear that concern?
Absolutely. And you can imagine that if you're the patient, you're getting information from every single direction. You're getting information from when you're looking at your computer. You're getting information from what you read in the New York Times. You're getting information from what your families are bringing to you, as well as then you're trying to interpret the information that your clinician is bringing to you. And that which feels essentially the most state-of-the-art, the shiniest new thing, feels like it should be the best thing for you. And so it does create this internal toggle where the hype feels like the best thing for you to do as a person. And one of the things I think we're going to move towards as we have more and more computerized systems doing some parts of medicine is the physician and the medical person is going to be more and more the translator that helps a patient try and work their way through all of that, because indeed that's what happens in our heads for all of us.
Thank you so much. Zach's going to tell you about lunch.
Thank you, Martha, for an expert job. I think we're a little late, and we're going to be back here at 1 o'clock, so eat fast.